Hey, it's April 4th, and we find ourselves in Judges chapters 13 through 16. Yes, I'm including chapter 16 from tomorrow's reading, but there's a reason. Our next judge needs no introduction. Today, we are talking about Samson. In chapter 13, which begins the seventh and final cycle of the Judges, verse 1 starts with, "The people of Israel again did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, and gave them in the hands of the Philistines for 40 years. Now, note that this time, Israel does not cry out to God for deliverance. They were probably never going to. This is the longest time that they will be oppressed by a foreign nation. And in spite of the fact that they kind of resigned themselves to being oppressed by the Philistines, God steps in anyway. Now the angel of the Lord, which is God himself, appears to Manoah and his wife and tells them that they would have a son who would begin, that's an important word, begin to save Israel from the hands of the Philistines. He would be a Nazirite for life. And what does that mean? Well, we find the Nazirite vow in Numbers chapter 6, verses 1 through 8. It was a temporary vow that people could make for whatever length of time they wanted. And during that time, they would not touch or go near a dead body, eat or drink anything that was made from the grapevine, and they would not cut their hair until the vow was over. Now, Samson would be a Nazirite for life, and we're going to see that he will actually break all three of those conditions before he loses his strength. In chapter 14, we find that Samson is now all grown up and wants to get married, and he asks specifically to get married to a Philistine woman. Now, this is against God's law because this is not a Philistine woman who's converted to Judaism, but she still worships the Philistines' primary deity, Dagon. And during this chapter, we're going to see he actually touches not one, but multiple dead bodies. The first would be the lion carcass in verses 5 through 9, and the second through 30th would be the Philistines he killed and took their clothes from to satisfy the bet he had lost with the Philistines in verse 19. We also find that at his wedding he drank wine. If we look at chapter 14, verse 10, it says, "Samson prepared a feast, for so the young men used to do." Now that would mean just like all the wedding feasts that all of the young men prepared, which would have included the consumption of wine. Now he should have lost his strength in this chapter for breaking either of those conditions, but he didn't. God was patient with him. Chapter 15, we find Samson fighting a few times against the Philistines. In verses 4 and 5, we find that he is so angry that the Philistine woman that he wanted to marry has actually been given to another man because he ran off and her father thought Samson had given up on her. That verse 4, Samson went and caught 300 foxes and took torches, and he turned them tail to tail, put a torch between each pair of tails. And verse 5, and when he had set fire to the torches, he let the foxes go into the standing grain of the Philistines and set fire to the stacked grain and the standing grain, as well as the olive orchards. Now, this isn't a one-time event, and this isn't him literally tying the fox's tails in a knot and putting a torch in the middle of the knot. I've seen pictures depicting that. That would be physically impossible. But more likely, he took ropes and tied one end of the rope to each of the fox's tails and attached to the rope in between them a torch and then lit that and let them go. And with the way it's described, this sounds like actually multiple attacks over a long period of time. Notice it says that he set them into the standing grain, into the stacked grain, and into the olive orchards. We're talking about three separate places. And so over a period of time, it sounds like Samson caught a total of 300 foxes and used them to burn the Philistine crops. In verses 15 through 17, we find that he kills 1,000 men using a donkey's jawbone. Verse 15 says he found a fresh jawbone of a donkey, another dead thing. And he put it in his hand and took it, and he struck 1,000 men. Verse 17, it says, as soon as he had finished speaking, he threw it away. He knew he wasn't supposed to touch it, according to his vow. Again, Samson should have lost his strength, but he didn't. God was continuing to be patient with him. In chapter 16, Samson still has his strength, and in verses 1 through 3, we find him in Gaza, the capital city of the Philistines, where he actually went to see a prostitute. But on his way out, verse 3, it says he took hold of the doors of the gate of the city and the two posts, pulled them up, bar and all, put them on his shoulders, and carried them to the top of the hill that is in front of Hebron. Now, if you just skip this, you miss how big of a demonstration of his strength this is. If you look on a Bible map, you'll see that it's over 37 miles from Gaza to Hebron, and he takes the gates of the city all the way there. They weren't getting him back. And chapter 16 closes with him falling in love with Delilah. Delilah is bribed by the Philistines to find out why Samson is so strong. And 3 times Samson teases her, giving her, just lying about why he is so strong. He says, if they bind me with 7 fresh bowstrings that have not been dried. Or verse 11, if they bind me with new ropes that have not been used. Or verse 13, if you weave the 7 locks of my head with the web and fasten it tight with a pin. And Delilah does all 3 of these things, has the Philistines attack him, and Samson still has his strength. Samson finally tells her the last condition of the Nazirite vow that he has not broken. Verse 17, and he told her all his heart and said to her, a razor has never come upon my head, for I have been a Nazirite to God from my mother's womb. If my head is shaved, then my strength will leave me, and I shall become weak and be like any other man. Now, he had to have known Delilah would cut his hair. She did the other 3 things, right? I believe he told her because I don't think he thought he would lose his strength even if his hair was cut. I mean, after all, he broke the other 2 conditions, the dead body thing, multiple times, we know for sure. Why would this be any different? Verse 20, it says he awoke from his sleep. I'm sure he's noticed that he's missing a lifetime of hair growth on his head. And he says, I will go out as the other times and shake myself free. Unfortunately, this was the last straw. There is a limit to God's patience. Do not mistake his patience with us for permission to sin. Verse 21 tells us the consequence of his disobedience. The Philistines seized him and gouged out his eyes and brought him down to Gaza and bound him with bronze shackles. And he ground at a mill in the prison, but the hair of his head began to grow again after it had been shaved. So he's in prison for an undisclosed period of time. Verses 23 through 31, we find that Samson gets his revenge. He is brought out at a celebration to Dagon for the Philistines to laugh at and to mock. He is led by a servant to the pillars that hold up the temple, and he cries out to God one last time to restore his strength, not to save Israel from the Philistines. Look at verse 28. It says, so that he could be avenged on the Philistines for my 2 eyes. This was still all about him. Verse 30, we find that the dead that he killed when he pushed the pillars apart and the temple fell on them, it says, were more than those whom he had killed during his life. Verse 27 told us that there were 3,000 men and women in the temple at that time. Now, Samson only began the deliverance of Israel from the Philistines, as God said all the way back in chapter 13, verse 5. If we fast forward a bit, Israel's next and final judge would actually be the prophet Samuel, and he would anoint a shepherd boy named David, a man after God's own heart, to be the second king of Israel who would complete Israel's deliverance from the Philistines. But this could have so easily been Samson. God had given them the great gift of superhuman strength. He had over 20 years that he could have used it to defeat the Philistines and save Israel from their bondage. But instead, he used it selfishly on himself. Samson's life is a tragedy. Now, like Samson, God has given us as believers great gifts, spiritual gifts, talents, resources, abilities, and he's given us the time that we have now on this earth to use them. We have the opportunity to strengthen other believers and share the gospel to deliver others from the bondage of sin and death. My prayer for us today is that we not waste the gifts that God has given us or the time he's given us, like Samson, but use them to free others from their slavery to sin and equip them to live the life of freedom that God created and saved us for. Now, if you haven't already, please download our Through the Bible reading plan from HispanicCommunityChurch.org/throughthebible. Put the link below again. Thanks again for watching, and I hope to see you again soon.